Let us then extend a gracious invitation to the esteemed reader to recall a certain promise made at the dawn of this history's second book. It was there we whispered our intention to leap over vast chasms of time, those lengthy seasons where the tapestry of events grew quiet, devoid of those vibrant threads worthy of being woven into a chronicle of this particular nature and grandeur. In undertaking such a narrative leap, we are not merely consulting our own authorial dignity and comfort, but we are acting as a benevolent guide to the reader's own intellect and precious hours. For consider the alternative we could force you, line by laborious line, through a barren desert of insignificant days, where no oasis of plot or character awaits. This we refuse to do. We thereby prevent you from squandering your most finite resource, your time in the tedious act of reading, without the slightest pleasure or profit. Instead, at these deliberate pauses, we grant you a singular opportunity. We hand you the quill of your own imagination, allowing you to employ that wonderful sagacity which you undoubtedly possess to fill these vacant spaces with the rich ink of your own conjectures. And fear not, for we have not sent you into this creative endeavor unarmed. In the preceding pages we have carefully equipped and qualified you for this very task. For example, what manner of reader, however casual, could possibly be ignorant of the fact that the worthy Mr. Allworthy was initially seized by a profound and piercing grief at the loss of his friend? Those initial raw emotions, the ones that invade every heart not forged of unfeeling flint or topped with a head of pure unyielding marble, certainly visited him. And again, what reader, possessing even a modicum of worldly understanding, does not know that the twin guardians of human sorrow, philosophy and religion, in time stepped in to temper and eventually extinguish this grief? The former philosophy, patiently instructing the soul on the utter folly and vanity of raging against a fate we all share; the latter, religion, gently correcting the sorrow as an unlawful excess of worldly attachment, while simultaneously assuaging the wound with the balm of future hopes and divine assurances. It is this potent combination that enables a strong and pious mind to bid farewell to a departing friend on his deathbed with a countenance of serene composure, with little less outward agitation than if he were seeing him off on a long journey to a distant pleasant land, and in truth with scarcely less hope of a glorious reunion in a world beyond our own. If you're enjoying this deep dive into narrative craft, make sure to subscribe for more literary analyses, nor should the judicious reader be left adrift concerning the conduct of the most discreet Mrs. Bridget Blifil. The reader may rest assured that she conducted herself through that entire formal season of mourning, that prescribed period during which grief is expected to make its meticulous appearance upon the outside of the body, with the most scrupulous and exacting regard for all the established rules of custom and decency. She became a master of sartorial and facial synchrony, matching the subtle alterations of her countenance precisely to the several graduated alterations of her wardrobe. For as her attire progressed solemnly from the deep shadows of full weeds to the starkness of unadorned black, from that black to the softer hue of gray, and finally from gray to the quiet peace of white, so too did her countenance undergo a masterful transformation. It moved from the theatrical depths of dismal to a more composed, sorrowful, from sorrowful to a pensive, sad, and from sad to a dignified, serious air, until at last the calendar bestowed its permission, allowing her to return with a quiet sigh of relief to her former state of serenity. We have offered these two examples, Mr. Allworthy's internal journey and Mrs. Blifil's external performance, merely as simple illustrations of the light exercises which may be imposed upon readers of the most elementary class. However, for the upper graduates in the sacred art of criticism, for those who have honed their faculties on the whetstone of the classics, we may reasonably anticipate much higher and more strenuous exercises of judgment and penetration. What's your favorite narrative, time skip, in literature? Let us know in the comments below. I have no doubt that such discerning individuals will make many notable discoveries concerning the transactions within the family of our worthy Squire during all those years we have thought proper to pass over in silence. For though we maintain that nothing rose to the level of deserving a place in this particular history, several incidents undoubtedly occurred of equal import and drama to those breathlessly reported by the daily and weekly historians of our age. It is in the consumption of such trivial, fleeting narratives that great multitudes of people sacrifice a considerable portion of their time, and I fear to very little lasting benefit or emolument. Now, in the conjectural exercises here, propose some of the most excellent faculties of the mind may be employed to tremendous advantage. Is it not a more useful and elevated capacity to be able to foretell the actions of men in any given circumstance, based on a deep understanding of their inherent character, than to merely judge of their character from their already performed actions? The former, I readily own, demands the greater penetration and insight, yet, when wielded by true sagacity, it can be accomplished with no less certainty than the latter, and as we are acutely sensible that much the greatest part of our readers are most eminently possessed of this very quality of insight, we have, with great confidence, left them a generous space of 12 full years to exert it in. The stage is set, the characters are known. Now the moment has come to lower the curtain on this interlude of speculation and to bring forth our hero. Let us meet him again, not as the infant found upon a pillow, but as a young man of about 14 years of age. We do this without question, fully aware that many have been long and most impatiently waiting to be properly introduced to his acquaintance. From the very inception of this history, we pledged a sacred vow to our muse and to you, dear reader, to flatter no man, to curry no favour, but to guide our pens solely by the unerring compass of truth. It is this solemn commitment that now obliges us to usher our hero onto the stage in a manner far more disadvantageous than our fondest authorial wishes would desire. We are compelled with a heavy heart to declare honestly, even at this, his formal reintroduction, that a universal opinion had solidified within the hallowed halls of Mr. Allworthy's estate. Young Tom Jones was most certainly born to be hanged. Indeed, I am sorrowed to report that this grim conjecture was rooted in what appeared to be substantial evidence. From his earliest years, the lad had discovered a pronounced propensity toward a catalogue of vices, and most notably to one which carries as direct a tendency toward that fatal finale as any other, a formidable disregard for the sacred laws of property. The ledger of his juvenile transgressions already boasted 3 convictions. First, the audacious robbery of a farmer's orchard. Second, the cunning theft of a duck from its rightful yard. And third, the deft picking of Master Blifil's pocket to liberate a ball. These vices of our young man were cast into a far more sinister and damning light by their stark contrast with the radiant virtues of his companion, Master Blifil. Here was a youth of such a diametrically opposite cast to the wild, untamed spirit of little Jones, that not only the household, but the entire neighborhood served as a chorus for his praises. He was in truth a lad of a most remarkable disposition, sober, discreet, and pious, to a degree that far exceeded his years. These qualities, polished to a brilliant sheen, gained him the love and admiration of all who knew him. Meanwhile, Tom Jones was universally disliked, a source of head-shaking and muttered concern. Many a tongue wagged in wonderment that Mr. Allworthy, a man of such impeccable judgment, would suffer such a corrupting sapling to be educated alongside his virtuous nephew, lest the latter's pristine morals be irrevocably tarnished by the former's foul example. An incident which transpired about this time shall serve to set the characters of these 2 lads more fairly before the discerning reader than the longest philosophical dissertation ever could. Tom Jones, who for all his faults must nonetheless serve as the hero of our history, could count only one true friend among the entire retinue of servants. For Mrs. Wilkins, that formidable woman, had long since washed her hands of him, having been perfectly reconciled to the perspectives of her mistress. This lone friend was the gamekeeper, a fellow of a loose and unrefined disposition, who was thought not to entertain notions concerning the difference between meum and tuum, what is mine and what is thine, that were any stricter than those held by the young gentleman himself. This alliance, unsurprisingly, provided fertile ground for many sarcastical remarks among the domestics. Most of these jibes were either proverbs before this instance, or have at least attained that status now, and indeed the collective wit of them all may be neatly encapsulated in that short, sharp Latin proverb, noscitur, a socio which finds its English counterpart in the timeless adage, "You may know a man by the company he keeps." To speak truth, some portion of that atrocious wickedness for which Jones was notorious, of which we have just mentioned 3 prime examples, might perhaps be traced to the pernicious encouragement he received from this very fellow. The gamekeeper had, in 2 or 3 instances, been what the law astutely terms an accessory after the fact, for the entirety of the purloined duck and a great part of the plundered apples were ultimately converted to the sustenance of the gamekeeper and his own family. Yet, as Jones alone had been discovered standing in the proverbial crumbs of the crime, the poor lad was forced to bear not only the full smart of the punishment, but the entire weight of the blame, a burden that was destined to fall upon his solitary shoulders once again on the occasion which follows. Contiguous to Mr. Allworthy's benevolent estate lay the manor of one of those gentlemen who are popularly designated as preservers of the game. This particular species of man, judging from the great severity with which they revenge the death of a single hare or partridge, might be thought to cultivate the same superstition as the Banyans in India, many of whom, we are told, dedicate their entire lives to the preservation and protection of certain animals. This theory would hold were it not for the fact that our English Banyans, while they preserve their game zealously from other enemies, will most unmercifully slaughter whole horse loads of the creatures themselves for their own tables, thus standing clearly acquitted of any such heathenish superstition, and revealing themselves instead as pragmatic monopolists of the hunt. I have in truth a much better opinion of this kind of men than is entertained by some, for I take them to answer the order of nature and the good purposes for which they were ordained in a more ample manner than many others. Now, as the poet Horace tells us that there are a set of human beings, fruges consumere nati, born to consume the fruits of the earth, so I make no manner of doubt but that there are others, feras consumere nati, born to consume the beasts of the field, or, as it is more commonly called, the game. And none, I believe, will deny that these country squires most diligently fulfill this particular end of their creation. It so happened that little Jones went out shooting one day with his sole companion, the gamekeeper. As fortune would have it, they chanced to spring a covey of partridges near the very border of that manor over which fate, to fulfill the wise purposes of nature, had planted one of these aforementioned game consumers. The birds in their panic flew directly into this forbidden territory and were marked, as the term is used by sportsmen, by the two eager individuals settling in some furze bushes about 200 or 300 paces beyond the safe dominions of Mr. Allworthy. Now Mr. Allworthy had given the gamekeeper the strictest of orders on pain of immediate forfeiture of his place never to trespass upon any of his neighbours' lands. This injunction applied no less to those who were less rigid in enforcing their boundaries than to the particularly zealous lord of this adjoining manor. With regard to other more lenient neighbours, these orders had not always been kept with the utmost scrupulosity, but as the severe and litigious disposition of the gentleman with whom the partridges had taken sanctuary was well known, the gamekeeper had, until this moment, never dared to attempt an invasion of his territories, nor would he have done so now had not the younger sportsman, who was excessively eager, his blood fired by the chase, over-persuaded him. But Jones, being fervent and importunate, and the gamekeeper himself being keen enough after the sport, the latter yielded to his persuasions. They crossed the invisible line, entered the sacred manor, and with a single shot felled one of the partridges. Enjoying this deep dive into character and morality, don't forget to subscribe for more classic storytelling. As fate would have it, the gentleman himself was on horseback at a little distance. The sharp report of the gun was a clarion call to battle. He immediately spurred his steed towards the sound and discovered poor Tom red-handed, for the wiser gamekeeper, upon hearing the approach, had leapt with the agility of a hare into the thickest part of the furze brake, where he happily concealed himself from view. The gentleman, having searched the trembling lad and found the warm partridge upon his person, denounced great vengeance, swearing with colourful oaths that he would acquaint Mr. Allworthy of this outrage. He was as good as his word, for he rode immediately to that good man's house and complained of the trespass upon his manor in as high terms and as bitter language as if his own house had been broken open and its most valuable furniture stolen. He added, with a sharp eye, that he was certain another person had been in the boy's company, though he could not discover him, for 2 guns had been discharged almost in the same instant. And said he, holding up the single bird as evidence, "We have found only this partridge, but the Lord alone knows what other mischief they have done." Upon his return home, Tom was presently convened before the tribunal of Mr. Allworthy. He owned the fact with a stumbling tongue, and alleged no other excuse but what was in its essence true, that the covey was originally sprung in Mr. Allworthy's own manner, and he had merely been following his legitimate quarry. Tom was then interrogated as to who had been with him. Mr. Allworthy declared he was resolved to know the truth, acquainting the culprit with the damning circumstance of the 2 guns which had been deposed by the squire and both his servants. But Tom, summoning a courage he rarely displayed in the schoolroom, stoutly persisted in asserting that he was alone. Yet, to speak the truth, he did hesitate a little at first, a fleeting moment of panic that would have confirmed Mr. Allworthy's belief in his duplicity had the squire's account required any further confirmation. The gamekeeper, being the obvious and suspected person, was now sent for. The question was put to him directly, but he, relying on the promise which Tom had hastily made him to take all the blame upon himself, very resolutely denied being in company with the young gentleman, or indeed having seen him the whole afternoon. Mr. Allworthy then turned towards Tom, his countenance clouded with more than usual anger, and advised him, in a tone that brooked no defiance, to confess who his accomplice had been. He repeated that he was resolved to know. The lad, however, held fast to his resolution, a strange and stubborn honour in his disobedience. He was dismissed with much wrath by Mr. Allworthy, who told him he should have until the next morning to consider it, at which time he would be questioned by another person and in another more formidable manner. Poor Jones spent a very melancholy night, the darkness of his room mirroring the darkness of his prospects. His solitude was amplified, for he was without his usual companion. Master Blifil was gone abroad on a visit with his mother. Fear of the physical punishment he was to suffer was on this occasion his least evil. His chief anxiety, a gnawing worm in his gut, was the terror that his constancy would fail him, that he would be broken and brought to betray the gamekeeper, whose utter ruin he knew must be the inevitable consequence. Nor did the gamekeeper pass his time in much better spirits. He laboured under the same apprehensions as the youth, for whose honour he had, perhaps to his own surprise, developed a much tenderer regard than he had for the boy's skin. In the morning, when Tom attended the Reverend Mr. Thwackum, the person to whom Mr. Allworthy had committed the instruction of the 2 boys, and a man who believed the rod to be a foremost instrument of education, he had the same questions put to him by that formidable gentleman. To these he returned the same answers. The consequence was as swift as it was severe, a whipping of such brutal intensity that it likely fell little short of the torture with which confessions are extorted from criminals in less enlightened lands. Tom bore his punishment with a fortitude that belied his years. Though his master asked him between every stinging stroke whether he would not now confess, the boy was contented to be flayed alive rather than betray his friend or break the promise he had made. What do you think of Tom's actions? Is he dishonest or loyal? Share your thoughts in the comments. The gamekeeper, upon hearing the outcome, was immediately relieved from his feverish anxiety, and Mr. Allworthy himself, a man of innate compassion, began to be genuinely concerned at the severity of Tom's sufferings. For besides that Mr. Thwackum, being highly enraged that he was not able to make the boy capitulate to his will, had carried his severity far beyond the good man's intention, Mr. Allworthy now began to suspect that the Squire had been mistaken. The Squire's extreme eagerness and anger seemed to make this probable. As for the servant's testimony, he laid no great stress upon it, knowing how easily such accounts can be coloured by a master's passion. Now, as cruelty and injustice were two ideas which Mr. Passion Allworthy could by no means support in his consciousness, for a single moment he sent for Tom. After many kind and friendly exhortations, he said, his voice softened with emotion, "I am convinced, my dear child, that my suspicions have wronged you. I am sorry that you have been so severely punished on this account." And at last, in a move that pierced Tom's heart more deeply than any lash, he gave him a little horse to make him amends again, repeating his sorrow for what had passed. This kindness was a punishment far more exquisite than any Thwackum could devise. Tom's guilt now flew in his face with greater force than any severity could have summoned. He could more easily bear the merciless lashes of the one than the overwhelming generosity of the other. The tears which pain could not extract now burst from his eyes as a floodgate opened. He fell upon his knees before his benefactor, crying, "Oh, sir, you are too good to me. Indeed you are. Indeed I don't deserve it." And in that very instant of emotional turmoil, from the fullness of his contrite heart, he almost betrayed the secret. But the good genius of the gamekeeper, or perhaps a nascent sense of higher loyalty, suggested to him what the consequences would be for the poor fellow, and this consideration sealed his lips once more. Mr. Thwackum, witnessing this scene, did all he could to persuade Allworthy from showing any further compassion or kindness to the boy. He has persisted in an untruth. Thwackum insisted, his face flushed with righteous indignation. He gave strong hints that a second, more vigorous whipping might probably bring the matter to light, like striking a rock to find water. But Mr. Allworthy absolutely refused to consent to the experiment. He said with a finality that silenced debate that the boy had suffered enough already for concealing the truth, even if he was guilty, for he could have no motive but a mistaken point of honor for so doing. "Honor," cried Thwackum, with considerable warmth. "Mere stubbornness and obstinacy. Can honor teach anyone to tell a lie? Or can any honor exist independent of religion?" This discourse happened at table when dinner was just ended. They were present Mr. Allworthy, Mr. Thwackum, and a third gentleman, who now entered into the debate with a calm and learned air. It is this third gentleman whom, before we proceed any further, we shall briefly introduce to our reader's acquaintance. The third gentleman, who had been residing for some time as a scholar in residence at Mr. Allworthy's hospitable table, was a man by the name of Mr. Squire. His natural intellectual gifts were not of the first dazzling rate. They were more akin to serviceable iron than precious gold. Yet he had hammered and polished them relentlessly upon the anvil of a learned education. He was deeply read in the ancients, their dusty tones having permanently stained his imagination, and he was a professed master of all the works of Plato and Aristotle. Upon these two colossal pillars of thought, he had principally constructed the edifice of his own intellect, sometimes finding himself marching in step with the opinion of the one, and at other times swinging to the measured cadence of the other. In matters of morals, he was a professed Platonist, gazing upward toward the ideal forms of justice and virtue. Yet, in the tangled woods of religion, he inclined to be an Aristotelian, examining the world with a more empirical, earthbound eye. But though he had, as we have said, sculpted his moral philosophy on the sublime Platonic model, he perfectly agreed with the opinion of Aristotle, who considered that great man rather in the quality of a philosopher or a speculatist than as a practical legislator for everyday life. This sentiment he carried a great way. Indeed, so far that it seemed he regarded all virtue as a matter of elegant theory, only a beautiful statue to be admired in the museum of the mind, rather than a tool to be dirtied in the fields of daily conduct. This, it must be noted, he never explicitly affirmed to any living soul, and yet, upon the least observation of his own conduct, I cannot help but conclude it was his genuine opinion, for this single premise serves to perfectly reconcile many glaring contradictions which might otherwise appear in the mosaic of his character. This gentleman, Mr. Squire, and the fiery Mr. Thwackum were like flint and steel. Scarce ever did they meet without striking off sparks of heated disputation, for their core tenets were indeed diametrically opposed, rooted in different soils and branching toward different heavens. Squire held human nature to be the very perfection of all virtue, a pristine wellspring from which goodness naturally flowed. In his view, vice was nothing but a tragic deviation from our true nature, a corruption as jarring and unnatural as a physical deformity. Thwackum, on the contrary, a man who saw the shadow of the fall upon every human soul, maintained that the human mind, in its natural state, was nothing but a sink of iniquity, a polluted swamp that could only be drained, purified, and redeemed by the divine machinery of grace. In one point only did these two opposing forces find a strange accord. In all their intricate discourses on morality, they scrupulously and likely deliberately never let the simple, warm word goodness pass their lips. The favorite phrase of the former was the natural beauty of virtue, a concept as clean and abstract as a geometrical proof. The mantra of the latter was the divine power of grace, a force that descended from above. The former measured all actions by the unalterable rule of right and the eternal fitness of things, a cosmic plumb line. The latter decided all matters by the thunderous gavel of authority, but in doing so, he always used the scriptures and their approved commentators, as a lawyer uses his Coke upon Littleton, where the comment through long tradition had acquired an authority nearly equal to the holy text itself. After this short introduction, the reader will be pleased to remember the cliff upon which we left the parson. He had concluded his speech with a triumphant ringing question, a verbal trap from which he apprehended no possible escape. Can any honor exist independent of religion? To this, Square answered with the calm, methodical air of a man unpacking a logical box. He began by stating that it was impossible to discourse philosophically concerning words until their meaning was first established and agreed upon. He noted that there were scarce any two words in the English tongue of a more vague and uncertain signification than the two just mentioned, honor and religion. For, said he, there were almost as many different opinions concerning the nature of honor as there were concerning the particulars of religion. But, said he, wielding his logic like a surgeon's scalpel, if by honor you mean the true natural beauty of virtue, then I will maintain it may exist independent of any religion whatever. Nay, he added, pressing his advantage, you yourself will allow it may exist independent of all but one, and by the same token, so will a Mahometan, a Jew, and all the maintainers of all the different sects in the world, each claiming honor as the exclusive flower of their own creed. Fascinated by these philosophical debates, subscribe for more deep dives into classic literature. Thwackum replied as if stung by a wasp, declaring this was arguing with the usual malice characteristic of all the enemies to the one true church. He said, his voice trembling with indignation, that he doubted not but that all the infidels and heretics in the world would, if they could confine honor to their own absurd errors and damnable deceptions. But honor, says he, is not therefore manifold, because there are many absurd opinions about it. Nor is religion manifold, because there are various sects and heresies in the world. When I mention religion, he thundered, narrowing the definition like a noose, I mean the Christian religion, and not only the Christian religion, but the Protestant religion, and not only the Protestant religion, but the Church of England. And when I mention honor, I mean that mode of divine grace which is not only consistent with, but is entirely dependent upon this religion, and is consistent with and dependent upon no other. Now, to say that the honor I here mean, and which was, I thought, all the honor I could be supposed to mean, will uphold, much less dictate, an untruth, is to assert an absurdity too shocking to be conceived. I purposely avoided, said Squire with a tone of superior patience, drawing a conclusion which I thought evident from what I have said. But if you perceived it, I am sure you have not attempted to answer it. However, to drop the contentious article of religion, I think it is plain from what you have said that we have fundamentally different ideas of honor. For why else do we not agree in the same terms of its explanation? I have asserted that true honor and true virtue are almost synonymous terms, and they are both founded on the unalterable rule of right and the eternal fitness, things to which an untruth, you must agree, being absolutely repugnant and contrary. It is certain that true honor cannot support an untruth. In this, therefore, I think we are agreed, but that this honor can be said to be founded on religion, to which it is logically antecedent, if by religion be meant any positive, codified law. I agree, answered Thwackum, with great warmth, his face flushing a deep crimson. With a man who asserts honor to be antecedent to religion, Mr. Allworthy, did you hear me agree? He was proceeding, his finger pointing accusatorially at Squire, when Mr. Allworthy himself interposed. His voice was calm, but a frost had settled upon it, telling them very coldly that they had both mistaken his meaning, for that he had said nothing of true honor in the abstract, but was speaking of the particular case of a boy in his household. It is possible, however, that even his considerable authority would not have easily quieted the two disputants, who were growing equally warm, their intellectual duel threatening to become something baser. Yet fortune, in her whimsy, now provided a diversion. Another matter of a more immediate and practical nature suddenly fell out, which put a final and decisive end to the conversation for the present, leaving the field of philosophical battle drawn but without a clear victor. Who do you side with in this debate? Squire's philosophy or Thwackum's theology? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Before my pen traces another word of this unfolding drama, I must beg a moment's indulgence from you, dear reader, to erect a bulwark against certain misconstructions into which the unbridled zeal of some few, however well-intentioned, may lead them. For my aim is to illuminate human folly, not to give wanton offense, especially to those men who are genuinely warm in the noble causes of virtue or religion, whose hearts are true temples to these sacred ideals. I hope, therefore, with every fibre of my authorial being, that no man will, through the grossest misunderstanding or wilful perversion of my meaning, misrepresent me as one who endeavours to cast ridicule upon the greatest perfections of human nature. These very perfections, true piety and unfeigned virtue, are in fact the sole alchemists that purify and ennoble the heart of man, lifting him from the mire of base instinct and raising him to a plane far above the brute creation. This, reader, I will venture to say, and by how much, the better and more virtuous a man you are yourself, by so much the more keenly will you be inclined to believe me that I would rather have buried the sentiments of these two persons, Thwackum and Squire, in the eternal oblivion of a silent grave than have done the slightest injury to either of these glorious causes. On the contrary, it is with a view to their very service and preservation that I have taken upon myself the duty of recording the lives and actions of two of their most false and pretended champions. A treacherous friend who wears the mask of devotion is infinitely more dangerous than an open enemy, and I will say boldly, without fear of contradiction from any who have observed the world with a clear eye, that both religion and virtue have received more real discredit from the poisonous wells of hypocrisy than the wittiest profligates or most cunning infidels could ever cast upon them through direct assault. Nay, let me go farther, as these two pillars in their pristine purity are rightly called the golden bands of civil society, and are indeed the greatest of blessings bestowed upon mankind. So when they are poisoned and corrupted with fraud, pretense, and affectation, they become the very worst of civil curses. It is under this corrupted banner that men have been enabled to perpetrate the most cruel and devastating mischiefs upon their own species, their consciences soothed by a distorted sense of righteousness. Indeed, I doubt not, but that this nuanced ridicule of the hypocrite, rather than the virtue he profanes, will in general be allowed by the judicious. My chief apprehension lies elsewhere, as many true and just sentiments did, on occasion, issue from the mouths of these very persons. I fear lest the whole of their discourse be taken together, and I be conceived to ridicule all alike, tarring the sacred with the brush of the profane. Now the reader will be pleased to consider a simple truth of human nature. As neither of these men were utter fools, they could not be supposed to have holden none but wrong principles, and to have uttered nothing but absurdities. They were learned men, and learning sometimes stumbles upon truth. What profound injustice, therefore, must I have done to their characters, had I selected only what was bad from their musings, and how horribly wretched and maimed must their arguments have appeared presented in such a dishonest, piecemeal fashion. Upon the whole, let this be my steadfast and clear declaration. It is not religion or virtue, but the palpable want of them which is here exposed. Had not Thwackum too much neglected the simple beauty of virtue, and Squire the profound necessity of religion, in the proud composition of their several systems, and had not both utterly discarded all natural goodness of heart, that untaught, spontaneous kindness, that is the true root of all moral action, they had never been represented as the objects of derision. In this history, it is the void where their hearts should be that we mock not the virtues they so eloquently preach. With this crucial distinction firmly established, we will now proceed with our narrative. This matter, then, which so fortuitously put an end to the heated debate recorded in the last chapter, was no other than a sudden and violent quarrel between Master Blifil and Tom Jones. The immediate consequence of this altercation had been a bloody nose bestowed upon the former, for though Master Blifil, notwithstanding he was the younger, was in size and bulk above the other's match, yet Tom was much his superior in the noble and democratic art of boxing, where spirit often trumps brute strength. Tom, however, had always cautiously avoided all physical engagements with that youth. The reasons were twofold. Firstly, because Tommy Jones was at his core an inoffensive lad amidst all his roguery, and still carried a spark of genuine, if misguided, affection for Blifil. And secondly, because the formidable presence of Mr. Thwackum, who was always the ready second and champion of the latter, would have been sufficient to deter a far braver heart than Tom's. But well says a certain author, whose wisdom echoes through the ages, "No man is wise at all hours." It is therefore no wonder that a boy, with his passion simmering so close to the surface, is not so. A sharp difference arising at play between the two lads, perhaps over a marble, a card, or a mere point of pride, Master Blifil, in a moment of spite, called Tom a beggarly bastard. Upon hearing this venomous appellation, the latter, who was somewhat passionate in his disposition, and whose sense of honour was raw and immediate, did not resort to words. Instead, he immediately caused that sanguineous phenomenon in the face of the former which we have above remembered. Master Blifil now, with his blood running in a crimson trickle from his nose, and the tears galloping in a hot stream from his eyes, appeared as a pitiable plaintiff before the court of his uncle and the tremendous Thwackum. In this domestic court, an indictment of assault, battery, and wounding was instantly preferred against Tom, who in his own defence could only plead the profound provocation of the insult, which was indeed the one material piece of evidence that Master Blifil had conveniently omitted from his recitation. It is indeed possible that this particular circumstance might have escaped his memory, so aggrieved was he, for in his reply he positively insisted with a look of wounded innocence that he had made use of no such appellation, adding with a piety that rang hollow in the tense air, "Heaven forbid such naughty words should ever come out of my mouth." Tom, though it was against all form of law and proper deference to let his accusation stand, rejoined with a fierce affirmance of the words, upon which Master Blifil, his eyes gleaming with a cunning light, said, "It is no wonder you persist in a lie. Those who will tell one fib will hardly stick at another. If I had told my master such a wicked fib as you have done, I should be ashamed to show my face." "What fib, child?" cries Thwackum, his interest sharpened, leaning forward with an eagerness that was anything but holy. "Why, he told you that nobody was with him a-shooting when he killed the partridge." Blifil explained, his voice quavering with what seemed like distress. Then he delivered his master stroke. But he knows, here he burst into a fresh flood of tears. "Yes, he knows, for he confessed it to me that Black George, the gamekeeper, was there. Nay, he said, yes, you did deny it, if you can, that you would not have confessed the truth, though master had cut you to pieces." At this revelation the fire of triumphant vindication flashed from Thwackum's eyes. "Oh ho!" he cried out, his voice a trumpet of judgment. "This is your mistaken notion of honor. This is the boy who was not to be whipped again." But Mr. Allworthy, his countenance bearing a more gentle and sorrowful aspect, turned towards the lad and said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "Is this true, child? How came you to persist so obstinately in a falsehood?" Tom, his own eyes now stinging with the shame of being caught in a half-truth, but not in a lie of malice, said he scorned a lie as much as anyone. He then endeavoured to explain the intricate web of his feelings, but he thought his honour engaged him to act as he did, for he had promised the poor fellow to conceal him. He added, he thought himself farther obliged to, as the gamekeeper had begged him not to go into the gentleman's manor, and had at last gone himself, not out of desire, but in compliance with his persuasions. He said this was the whole truth of the matter, and he would take his oath of it. He concluded with a passion that came from the very core of his being, passionately begging Mr. Allworthy to have compassion on the poor fellow's family, especially as he himself only had been guilty, and the other had been very difficultly prevailed on to do what he did. "Indeed, sir," said he, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush, "it could hardly be called a lie that I told, for the poor fellow was entirely innocent of the whole matter. I should have gone alone after the birds. Nay, I did go at first, and he only followed me to prevent more mischief. Do pray, sir, let me be punished. Take my little horse away again, but pray, sir, forgive poor George." Mr. Allworthy, a man torn between the rigid demands of justice and the soft pleadings of mercy, hesitated a few moments, his internal conflict playing out upon his noble features. The room held its breath. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his guardianship, he dismissed the boys, advising them in a tone of weary hope to live more friendly and peaceably together in the future. It is highly probable that by his calculated disclosure of this secret, a confidence whispered to him in what should have been the sacred vault of friendship, young Blifil had in fact preserved his companion from a most severe and righteous lashing, for the offence of the bloody nose alone would have been sufficient cause for the zealous Thwackum to proceed immediately to correction, his rod thirsting for justice. But now this lesser transgression was totally absorbed and forgotten in the overwhelming consideration of the other graver matter, the lie. And yet, with regard to this very falsehood, Mr. Allworthy, after private reflection, declared that he thought the boy deserved reward rather than punishment for the motive behind it, a sentiment that stayed Thwackum's hand and resulted in a general pardon that stuck in the pedagogue's craw. Thwackum, whose meditations were forever steeped in the bitter tea of birch, exclaimed loudly against what he termed this weak, and as he said, he would venture to call it, with all due respect, this wicked lenity. To remit the punishment of such crimes, he thundered, was to actively encourage them to sow the seeds of future iniquity in a fertile field. He enlarged much upon the divine duty of correcting children, painting a vivid picture of spoiled rot that must be carved out, and quoted many stern texts from Solomon and other authorities, which texts, being already so plentifully scattered through so many other volumes of instruction and terror, shall not be needlessly repeated here. Having exhausted that topic, he then applied the full force of his learning to the specific vice of lying, on which head he was altogether as learned and merciless as he had been on the other. Squire, in turn, said that he had been diligently endeavoring to reconcile the puzzling behavior of Tom with his own pristine idea of perfect virtue, but had found it an impossible equation. He owned with a tone of intellectual concession that there was something which, at first glance, appeared to wear the mask of fortitude in the action, but as true fortitude was a cardinal virtue and falsehood an undeniable vice, the two could by no means agree or unite together in the same deed. It was a philosophical paradox, he added with a subtle glance toward his rival, that as this line of thinking was in some measure to confound virtue and vice, it might be worth Mr. Thwackum's consideration whether a larger castigation might not be laid on for this very philosophical confusion atop the punishment for the lie itself. As both these learned men concurred in their stern censuring of Jones, so were they no less unanimous in their vigorous applauding of Master Blifil. To bring truth to light, to drag deception from its shadowy den, was by the parson asserted to be the bounden duty of every religious man, and by the philosopher this very act was declared to be highly conformable with the rule of right and the eternal and unalterable fitness of things, a rare moment of harmony founded on their shared disapproval of Tom's messy human loyalty. All this sophisticated rhetoric, however, weighed very little in the scales of Mr. Allworthy's own heart. He could not be prevailed upon to sign the mental warrant for the execution of Jones's character. There was something within his own breast, a native sense of honor and fidelity, with which the invincible, albeit misguided loyalty that youth had preserved corresponded much more deeply than it did with the rigid religion of Thwackum or the theoretical virtue of Squire. He therefore strictly ordered the former of these gentlemen to abstain from laying violent hands on Tom for what had passed. The pedagogue was obliged to obey these orders, for his bread was buttered by Allworthy's generosity, but not without great reluctance and frequent dark mutterings that the boy would be certainly spoiled, his soul left to putrefy in its own stubbornness. Towards the gamekeeper, however, the good man behaved with considerably more severity. He presently summoned that poor fellow before him, and after many bitter remonstrances that laid bare the man's moral cowardice, paid him his outstanding wages, and dismissed him from his service forthwith, for Mr. Allworthy rightly observed, with a moral clarity that cut through the philosophical fog, that there was a great and fundamental difference between being guilty of a falsehood to excuse yourself and telling one to excuse another. He likewise urged, as the principal motive for his inflexible severity against this man, that he had basely suffered Tom Jones, a mere boy, to undergo so heavy a punishment for his sake, whereas he, a grown man, ought to have prevented it by making the discovery himself, bearing the weight of his own failings. When this story became public, rippling through the parish, many people differed quite sharply from the judgments of Squire and Thwackum. Master Blifil was generally called a sneaking rascal, a poor-spirited wretch, and was painted with other epithets of the like kind, whilst Tom was honoured with the appellations of a brave lad, a jolly dog, and an honest fellow. Indeed, his behaviour to Black George much ingratiated him with all the servants, for though that fellow was before universally disliked, yet he was no sooner turned away than he was as universally pitied. His absence softening hearts, his presence had hardened. The friendship and gallantry of Tom Jones were celebrated by them all with the highest applause, and they condemned Master Blifil as openly as they durst, without incurring the dangerous disfavour of his mother. For all this popular acclaim, however, poor Tom continued to smart in the flesh. For though Thwackum had been specifically inhibited from exercising his arm on the foregoing account, yet, as the proverb wisely says, it is easy to find a stick to beat a dog. So was it easy for Thwackum to find a rod, and indeed, the not being able to find one was the only thing which could have kept that zealous disciplinarian any long time from chastising poor Jones. A missed lesson in Greek, a slouching posture, a poorly timed grin, all served as adequate pretexts for the catharsis of correction. Had the bare delight in the sport of whipping been the only inducement to the pedagogue, it is probable Master Blifil would likewise have had his share. But though Mr. Allworthy had given him frequent orders to make no difference between the lads, yet was Thwackum altogether as kind and gentle to this youth as he was harsh, nay, even barbarous to the other. To say the truth, Blifil had greatly gained his master's affections, partly by the profound, almost grovelling respect he always showed his person, but much more by the decent reverence with which he received his doctrine, for he had got by heart and frequently repeated his master's favourite phrases, and maintained all his religious principles with a zeal which was surprising in one so young, and which greatly endeared him to the worthy preceptor. Tom Jones, on the other hand, was not only deficient in outward tokens of respect, often forgetting to pull off his hat or to bow at his master's approach, but was altogether as unmindful both of his master's precepts and his example. He was indeed a thoughtless, giddy youth, with little sobriety in his manners and less in his countenance, and would often very impudently and indecently laugh at his companion for his serious, almost funereal behaviour. Mr. Squire had much the same reason for his preference of the former lad, for Tom Jones showed no more regard to the learned discourses which this gentleman would sometimes throw away upon him than to those of Thwackum. He once even ventured to make a jest of the hallowed rule of right, and at another time said he believed there was no rule in the world capable of making such a man as his father for so Mr. Allworthy, in his boundless affection, suffered himself to be called. Master Blifil, on the contrary, had address enough at 16 to recommend himself at one and the same time to both these opposites, a veritable chameleon of virtue. With one he was all religion, with the other he was all virtue. And when both were present, he was profoundly silent, a canvas upon which each could paint his own likeness, and which both interpreted in his favor, and more importantly, in their own. Nor was Blifil contented with flattering both these gentlemen to their faces. He took frequent occasions of praising them behind their backs to Allworthy, before whom, when they two were alone and his uncle commended any religious or virtuous sentiment, for many such came constantly from him, he seldom failed to ascribe it to the good instructions he had received from either Thwackum or Squire. He knew his uncle repeated all such compliments to the persons for whose use they were meant, and he found by experience the irresistible impressions which they made on the philosopher as well as on the divine. For, to say the truth, there is no kind of flattery so potent and so irresistible as this at second hand. The young gentleman, moreover, with a precocious understanding of human vanity, soon perceived how extremely grateful all those panegyrics on his instructors were to Mr. Allworthy himself, for they so loudly resounded the praise of that singular and ambitious plan of education which he had laid down. This worthy man, having observed the imperfect institution of our public schools and the many vices which boys were there liable to learn, had resolved to educate his nephew as well as the other lad, whom he had in a manner adopted within his own house. Here, in this controlled environment, he thought their morals would escape all that danger of being corrupted to which they would be unavoidably exposed in any public school or university. Having therefore determined to commit these boys to the tuition of a private tutor, Mr. Thwackum was recommended to him for that office by a very particular friend, a man of whose understanding Mr. Allworthy had a great opinion, and in whose integrity he placed much confidence. This Thwackum was a fellow of a college where he almost entirely resided, and had a great reputation for learning religion and sobriety of manners, and these were doubtless the qualifications by which Mr. Quations, Allworthy's friend, had been induced to recommend him, though indeed this friend had some obligations to Thwackum's family, who were the most considerable persons in a borough, which that gentleman represented in Parliament, a circumstance which never publicly clouded the recommendation. Thwackum, at his first arrival, was extremely agreeable to Allworthy, and indeed he perfectly answered the character which had been given of him. Upon longer acquaintance, however, and more intimate conversation, this worthy man saw infirmities in the tutor, shadows, and rigidities which he could have wished him to have been without, though as those seemed greatly overbalanced by his good qualities, they did not incline Mr. Allworthy to part with him, nor would they indeed have justified such a proceeding, for the reader is greatly mistaken if he conceives that Thwackum appeared to Mr. Allworthy in the same harsh light as he doth to us in this history, with all his faults laid bare, and he is as much deceived if he imagines that the most intimate acquaintance which he himself could have had with that divine would have informed him of those things which we from our omniscient inspiration are enabled to open and discover, of readers who from such conceits as these condemn the wisdom or penetration of Mr. Allworthy. I shall not scruple to say that they make a very bad and ungrateful use of that knowledge which we have so generously communicated to them. These apparent errors in the doctrine of Thwackum, which Allworthy gently noted, served greatly to palliate the contrary errors in that of Squire, which our good man no less saw and condemned. He thought indeed that the different exuberancies of these gentlemen would correct their different imperfections, and that from both, especially with his own benevolent guidance, the two lads would derive sufficient precepts of true religion and virtue. If the event happened contrary to his expectations, this possibly proceeded from some fault in the plan itself, which the reader hath my leave to discover if he can, for we do not pretend to introduce any infallible characters into this history, where we hope nothing will be found which hath never yet been seen in the complex, contradictory tapestry of human nature. To return, therefore, to our narrative, the reader will not, I think, wonder that the different behavior of the two lads above commemorated produced the different effects of which he hath already seen some instance. And besides this, there was another more hidden reason for the conduct of the philosopher and the pedagogue. But this being matter of great importance, we shall reveal it in the next chapter. It is now to be made known to the discerning reader that those two learned personages, who have lately strutted and fretted their hour upon the considerable stage of this history, had from the very moment of their first arrival at Mr. Allworthy's hospitable house taken so profound an affection, the one to his seemingly boundless virtue, the other to his respectable piety, that they had each independently meditated the closest possible alliance with the good Squire himself. For this ambitious purpose, their calculating eyes, sharpened by self-interest, had naturally fallen upon that fair widow who, though our narrative has for some time been occupied with other matters, the reader, we trust, hath not utterly forgotten. Mrs. Bridget Blifil was, in truth, the golden object to which both their separate ambitions desperately aspired, the ultimate prize. In their quiet campaign for social and financial elevation, it may seem remarkable, nay, almost a paradox of human desire, that of the four principal persons we have commemorated at Miss Allworthy's house, three of them, the captain being the first, should fix their connubial inclinations on a lady who was never greatly celebrated for the dazzling power of her beauty, and who was, moreover now, a little descended into that vale of years, where the bloom of youth is but a cherished memory. But, in the curious reality of human nature, bosom friends and intimate male acquaintance, when regularly admitted to the inner sanctum of a friend's home, often develop a kind of natural propensity to attach themselves to particular females of the household, viz., to his grandmother, mother, sister, daughter, aunt, niece, or cousin, when those relatives are known to be rich, and to his wife, sister, daughter, niece, cousin, mistress, or even the comely servant maid, if they should be endowed with the more immediate advantages of handsome features. We would not, however, have our reader imagine that persons of such ostentatiously supported character as Thwackum and Squire would undertake a matter of this kind, a pursuit which has been, we admit, a little censured by some more rigid moralists before they had thoroughly examined it with their respective philosophical and theological lenses. They needed to be convinced it was as the immortal Shakespeare phrases it, not merely stuff of the conscience. Thwackum was notably encouraged in his undertaking by reflecting with a lawyer's precision that the specific commandment, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife," notably omits any mention of a neighbor's sister. He knew it was a foundational rule in the construction of all laws, both divine and mortal, that expressum facit cessare tacitum, the sense of which is, when a lawgiver sets down plainly his whole meaning, we are thereby prevented from making him mean what we might please ourselves to imagine. As some specific instances of forbidden women are mentioned in the divine law, which forbids us to covet our neighbor's goods, and that of a sister is conspicuously omitted, he logically concluded it to be entirely lawful. And as to Squire, who was in his person what the world calls a jolly fellow, or more specifically, a widow's man, he easily reconciled his choice to the eternal fitness of things, arguing that a union between a philosopher of his stature and a lady of her station was a perfectly harmonious arrangement in the great chain of being. Now, as both of these gentlemen were industrious in sowing every opportunity to recommend themselves to the widow, they shrewdly apprehended that one certain method of cultivation was by giving her son, young Master Blifil, the constant and marked preference over the other lad. They rightly conceived that the conspicuous kindness and affection which Mr. Poles Allworthy showered upon the Foundling must be highly disagreeable to a mother's heart, and they doubted not that seizing every occasion to degrade and vilify him would be highly pleasing to her. In their calculus, she who hated the boy must inevitably love all those who did him any hurt. In this particular strategy, Thwackum held a distinct tactical advantage, for while Squire could only scarify the poor lad's reputation with words, Thwackum could flea his very skin with the rod, and indeed he began to consider every stinging lash he bestowed upon Tom as a compliment paid directly to his mistress, so that he could, with the utmost propriety, repeat that old flogging line from the schoolmen, "Castigo te non quod odio habim, sed quod amem." I chastise thee, not out of hatred, but out of love. And this pious justification, indeed, he often had in his mouth, or rather, according to the old phrase, never more properly applied, at his very fingers' ends. For this reason principally the two gentlemen concurred, as we have seen in the preceding chapters, in their harsh opinion concerning the two lads. This was indeed almost the sole instance of their harmonious concurrence on any point, for beside the fundamental difference of their principles, they had both long ago strongly suspected each other's design upon the widow, and had consequently begun to hate one another with no little degree of inveteracy. Their rivalry, simmering beneath a thin veneer of academic courtesy, this mutual animosity was a good deal increased by their alternate perceived successes, for Mrs. Blifil, a woman of no small intuition, knew what they would be at long before they imagined she had perceived it, or indeed long before they had intended she should. They proceeded with great caution, lest she should be offended, and in a fit of fury acquaint Mr. Allworthy. But they had no reason for any such fear. She was well enough pleased with a passion of which she intended none should ever reap the fruits but herself, and the only fruits she designed for herself were the sweet, non-committal harvests of flattery and courtship. For this purpose, she became a masterful conductor of their affections, soothing them by turns, and for a long time maintained an exquisite, teasing balance. She was in her own mind rather inclined to favor the parson's stern principles, but Squire's person was decidedly more agreeable to her eye, for he was a comely man, whereas the pedagogue did in countenance very nearly resemble that severe gentleman who in Hogarth's Harlot's Progress is seen correcting the poor ladies in Bridewell. If you're enjoying these deep character analyses, be sure to subscribe for more literary insights, whether Mrs. Blifil had been surfeited with the sweets of marriage by her first husband, or utterly disgusted by its bitters, or from what other secret cause it proceeded, I will not pretend to determine. But she could never be brought to listen with any seriousness to any second proposals of marriage. However, her flirtation was not without consequence. She at last conversed with Squire with such a degree of pointed intimacy that malicious tongues throughout the parish began to whisper things of her, to which, as well for the sake of the lady's reputation, as that they were highly disagreeable to the rule of right and the fitness of things, we will give no credit. We shall therefore not blot our paper with them. The poor pedagogue, 'tis certain, whipped on with relentless zeal, without ever getting a step nearer to his journey's end than the doorstep of her drawing-room. Indeed, he had committed a great error in his strategy, an error which the more socially adept Squire discovered much sooner than himself. Mrs. Blifil, as perhaps the astute reader may have formerly guessed, was not over and above pleased with the memory of her late husband's behavior. Nay, to be perfectly honest, she absolutely hated him till his death. At last, a little reconciled him to her affections by the simple virtue of his absence. It will not be therefore greatly wondered at if she had not cultivated the most violent or natural regard for the offspring she had by him, and in fact she had so little of this maternal regard that in his infancy she seldom saw her son or took any notice of him. She was content to leave him to the care of nurses and servants. Hence, after a very little and performative reluctance, she acquiesced in all the favours which Mr. Allworthy showered on the Foundling, whom the good man in his boundless compassion called his own boy, and in all things put on an entire equality with Master Blifil. This very acquiescence in Mrs. Blifil was considered by the neighbours and by the family as a mark of her admirable condescension to her brother's peculiar humour, and she was imagined by all others, as well as by the hopeful Thwackum and Squire, to hate the Foundling. In her heart, it was a perfect performance. Nay, the more external civility she showed young Tom, the more profoundly they conceived she detested him, and the surer and more cunning schemes she was laying for his ultimate ruin. For as they thought it was her clear interest to hate him, it became very difficult for her to persuade them she did not. Thwackum was the more confirmed in this opinion, as she had more than once with a sly word and a meaningful glance caused him to whip Tom Jones, always at a time when Mr. Allworthy, who was a known enemy to this violent exercise, was safely abroad, whereas she had never given any such secret orders concerning her own son, young Blifil. This clever manipulation had likewise imposed upon Square's judgment. In reality, though, she certainly harbored a coldness toward her own son, of which, however monstrous it appears, I am assured by those who study human nature that she is not a singular instance. She appeared, notwithstanding all her outward compliance, to be in her heart sufficiently displeased with all the favour shown by Mr. Allworthy to the Foundling. Who do you think is the more cunning strategist in this love triangle? Share your thoughts in the comments below. She frequently complained of this partiality behind her brother's back, and very sharply censured him for it, both to the eager ears of Thwackum and Square. Nay, she would even throw it in the teeth of Allworthy himself, when a little matrimonial quarrel, or a miff, as it is vulgarly called, arose between them. However, as nature will have her way, a great shift occurred when Tom grew from a boy into a young man and began to give unmistakable tokens of that gallantry of temper, that vibrant and masculine spirit which so greatly recommends men to women. This initial disinclination which she had discovered to him when a child, by almost imperceptible degrees abated, the ice around her heart began to thaw, and at last she so evidently and publicly demonstrated her affection for him to be much stronger than what she bore her own son, that it became impossible for even the most blinded observer to mistake her any longer. She was so desirous of often seeing him, and discovered such open satisfaction and delight in his company, that before he was 18 years old, the gallant Tom had become a most formidable and natural rival to both the learned Square, the severe Thwackum. And what is worse for our hero, the whole country began to talk as loudly of her inclination to Tom as they had before done of that which she had shown to Square, on which account the jilted philosopher conceived the most deep and implacable hatred for our poor, unsuspecting hero, a hatred that would seek its opportunity for revenge, though the excellent Mr. Allworthy was not by his own noble nature hasty to view things through a darkened or disadvantageous lens, and remained largely a stranger to that fickle public voice which so seldom reaches the ears of a brother or a husband in its true form. Yet it rings with deafening clarity throughout the entire neighborhood. Yet even he could not remain entirely blind to the conspicuous affection Mrs. Blifil showed Tom, and the marked preference which she too visibly gave him over her own son. This unfortunate dynamic was of the utmost disadvantage to that poor youth Tom Jones, for such was the profound, almost overwhelming compassion that inhabited the deepest chambers of Mr. Allworthy's mind, that nothing but the cold, unyielding steel of undeniable justice could ever hope to subdue it. To be unfortunate in any respect was in his eyes sufficient, if there was no glaring demerit to counterpoise it, to turn the delicate scale of that good man's pity, and to actively engage his friendship and his benefaction. His heart was a fertile soil, and the slightest seed of misfortune could sprout into a forest of goodwill. When therefore he plainly saw, with a dawning and sorrowful clarity, that Master Blifil was absolutely detested, for that he was in the cold recesses of his mother's heart by his own mother, he began on that account alone to look upon the torsion sorrowful clarity. Boy, with an eye of deepening compassion. He saw in young Blifil a victim of maternal neglect, a soul starved of the most fundamental affection, and what the powerful transformative effects of such compassion are in good and benevolent minds such as his, I need not here explain, in tedious detail to the better part of my readers, whose own hearts will readily supply the answer. Henceforward, a subtle alchemy occurred in Mr. Allworthy's perception. He now saw every faint appearance of virtue in the youth through the magnifying end of the telescope, amplifying every minor act of piety into a grand gesture. Conversely, he viewed all of Blifil's faults and petty tyrannies with the glass inverted, so that they shrank, becoming scarce perceptible mere specks on a distant horizon. And this initial adjustment of vision, this charitable bias, perhaps the amiable temper of pity, may make commendable in a truly Christian heart. But the next step in this emotional journey must be excused by the inherent weakness of human nature alone. For he no sooner perceived that undeniable galling preference which Mrs. Blifil gave to Tom than that poor unsuspecting youth, however innocent in the matter of her affections, began to sink in his guardian's affections precisely as he rose in hers. It was a tragic equilibrium, a teeter-totter of regard, where Tom's gain was his own loss. This shift, it must be acknowledged, would of itself alone never have been powerful enough to eradicate the deeply planted fondness for Jones from Mr. Allworthy's bosom, but it was greatly injurious to him, creating hairline fractures in the foundation of their relationship. It prepared the fertile soil of Mr. Allworthy's mind for those darker impressions which were later to be sown and which afterwards produced the mighty and tumultuous events that will be contained hereafter in this history, and to which cataclysm, it must be confessed in all fairness, the unfortunate lad, by his own youthful wantonness, untamable wildness, and a grievous want of caution, too abundantly contributed. Found this character study compelling? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into classic literature. In recording some particular instances of these follies, we shall, if rightly understood by the discerning reader, afford a very useful and practical lesson to those well-disposed youths who shall hereafter be our readers. For they may here find to their potential cost that mere goodness of heart and a spontaneous openness of temper, though these may give them great comfort within their own breasts, and administer to an honest, justifiable pride in their own minds, will by no means, alas, do their necessary business in the harsh, judgmental world. Prudence and circumspection are necessary armor, even for the best of men. They are not mere ornaments for the wicked. They are indeed, as it were, a loyal guard to virtue, without which she can never be safe on her perilous journey through life. It is not enough that your designs, nay, that your very actions, are intrinsically good. You must take exceeding care that they shall appear so to the cynical eye of the world. If your inside be never so beautiful, a pristine palace of good intentions, you must preserve a fair and respectable outside also, lest the world mistake the palace for a ruin. This external presentation must be constantly looked to, diligently maintained, or else malice and envy, those twin artisans of slander, will take care to blacken it so thoroughly, to splatter it with such convincing mud, that even the native sagacity and inherent goodness of an Allworthy will not be able to see through the grime to discern the hidden beauties within. Let this, my young and hopeful readers, be your constant maxim engraved upon the tablet of your understanding, that no man can ever be good enough to enable him to safely neglect the sacred rules of prudence. Nor will virtue herself look beautiful in the eyes of a suspicious world unless she be bedecked with the outward ornaments of decency and decorum. A diamond, however pure, must be cleaned and set to sparkle. What's your take on balancing inner virtue with outer appearance? Share your wisdom in the comments, and this vital precept: my worthy disciples, if you read with due attention and a humble heart, you will, I hope, find sufficiently enforced and illustrated by a multitude of examples in the following pages of this history. Life itself will become your stern teacher. I must now ask the reader's pardon for this brief appearance by way of a chorus upon the stage of our narrative. It is in reality for my own sake and for the sake of clarity that while I am discovering and charting the treacherous rocks on which innocence and goodness so often split their fragile hulls, I may not be misunderstood to be recommending the very means, namely imprudence, by which I intend to show my worthy readers how they too might be undone. I am describing the disease, not prescribing the poison, and this crucial distinction, as I could not prevail on any of my actors to speak it without breaking character, I myself was obliged to step forward and declare from the wings. The attentive reader may perhaps remember that in a former chapter, the benevolent Mr. Allworthy had presented Tom Jones with a fine little horse, not merely as a gift, but as a kind of recompense, a piece of smart money intended to heal the wounds of the punishment which he now believed the boy had suffered innocently in the partridge affair. This horse, a spirited but gentle creature, Tom kept and cared for, above half a year, developing a genuine affection for the animal. He would often be seen brushing its coat to a shine or feeding it apples from his open palm. Yet destiny had other plans. One day Tom rode the horse to a neighboring fair, a bustling scene of commerce and chatter, and there with a heavy heart he sold him. Upon his return to the estate, the ever-watchful Thwackum, whose curiosity was as sharp as his rod, immediately questioned Tom about what he had done with the money for which the horse was sold. The lad, with a stubborn frankness that was both his virtue and his flaw, declared he would not tell him. "Oh ho," says Thwackum, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of triumph and fury. "You will not? Then I will have it out of your BR." That particular part of the human anatomy being the place to which he always applied for information on every doubtful occasion, his own peculiar oracle of truth. In a moment the familiar scene of domestic tyranny was arranged. Tom was now mounted on the broad, unyielding back of a stout footman, and everything was prepared for the execution of justice as Thwackum saw it. The air grew thick with anticipation, but just as the pedagogue was about to commence his interrogatory punishment, Mr. Allworthy, drawn by the commotion, or perhaps by some finer instinct, entered the room. With a single look he gave the criminal a reprieve, and taking the boy by the arm, led him with a grave countenance into another, more private apartment. There, being alone with Tom, away from the oppressive presence of Thwackum, he put the same question to him, but in a tone of calm inquiry rather than angry demand. Tom's defiance, so firm against Thwackum, melted in the face of his benefactor's gentle authority. He answered that he could, in duty, refuse Mr. Allworthy nothing. But as for that tyrannical rascal, he would never make him any other answer than with a cudgel with which he hoped soon to be able to pay him for all his barbarities. Mr. Allworthy very severely reprimanded the lad for his indecent and disrespectful expressions concerning his master, but he chastised him much more sternly for openly avowing an intention of revenge. He threatened him with the entire and irrevocable loss of his favour if he ever heard such another vengeful word from his mouth, for he said with great solemnity, he would never support or befriend a reprobate who nurtured such bitter passions. By these and other grave declarations, he managed to extort some show of compunction from Tom, in which that youth was not entirely over-sincere, for in the secret chambers of his heart he really meditated some physical return for all the smarting favours he had received at the hands of the merciless pedagogue. He was, however, brought by Mr. Allworthy's earnest appeal to express a superficial concern for his own resentment against Thwackum. Then the good man, after administering some more wholesome admonition about the Christian duty of forgiveness, permitted him to proceed with his original explanation, which he did as follows, his voice softening with genuine emotion. "Indeed, my dear sir," he began, "I love and honour you more than all the world I know, the great obligations I have to you, and should detest myself if I thought my heart was capable of such black ingratitude. Could the little horse you gave me speak, I am sure he could tell you with his own voice how fond I was of your present, for I assure you I had more pleasure in the simple act of feeding him and caring for him than in the excitement of riding him. Indeed, sir, it went directly to my heart to part with him, nor would I have sold him upon any other account in the world than the one which I did. You yourself, sir, I am convinced, were you in my precise situation, would have done the very same, for no one ever so sensibly felt the misfortunes of others as you do. What would you feel, dear sir, if you thought yourself the occasion of them? Indeed, sir, there never was any misery like theirs. Like whose child, says Allworthy, his curiosity now fully awakened. What do you mean, oh sir? Answered Tom, his composure. Breaking your poor gamekeeper Black George with all his large and helpless family ever since your discarding him, have been perishing with all the complex miseries of cold and hunger. I could not bear to see these poor wretches naked and starving, and at the same time know myself to have been the occasion of all their sufferings. I could not bear it, sir. Upon my soul, I could not. Here the tears ran down his cheeks in earnest, and he thus proceeded, his voice choked with feeling. It was to save them from absolute destruction that I parted with your dear present, notwithstanding all the value I had for it. I sold the horse for them, and they have every farthing of the money." Mr. Allworthy now stood silent for some moments, utterly taken aback by this revelation. He was a man who valued charity above almost all other virtues, and here was what appeared to be a profound, selfless act of it from the most unexpected quarter. Before he could speak, the tears started from his own eyes, mirroring the boy's. He was moved by the kindness, though troubled by the method. He at length dismissed Tom with a gentle rebuke, advising him for the future to apply to him directly in cases of distress he discovered, rather than to use such extraordinary and secretive means of relieving them himself. This affair, rich with moral complexity, was afterwards the subject of much heated debate between the two resident philosophers, Thwackum and Squire. Thwackum held with unshakable conviction that Tom's action was a flying in the very face of Mr. Allworthy's authority, who had intended the gift as a personal comfort for Tom, not as a fund for the dismissed servant whom he had justly punished for his disobedience. He said in some instances what the blind world called charity appeared to him to be a proud opposition to the will of the Almighty, which had in its inscrutable wisdom marked some particular persons for destruction, and that this was in like manner acting in direct opposition to Mr. Allworthy's disciplinary intentions, concluding, as was his invariable custom, with a hearty recommendation of the birch as the only proper response to such insolent benevolence. Squire, ever the contrarian, argued strongly on the other side, perhaps in genuine opposition to Thwackum, or perhaps in shrewd compliance with Mr. Allworthy, who had seemed very much to approve the spirit, if not the execution of what Jones had done. As to the specific arguments Squire urged on this occasion, they were likely elaborate and finely spun from the threads of classical philosophy. However, as I am convinced most of my readers will be much abler advocates for poor Jones, possessing a more natural and less pedantic moral sense, it would be impertinent to relate them here. Indeed, it was not difficult to reconcile Tom's action to the rule of right. It was a deed which sprang naturally from compassion and a sense of responsibility. Conversely, it would have been impossible to logically deduce such a noble action from any rule of wrong. It has been observed by some man of much greater reputation for wisdom than myself that misfortunes seldom come single, but arrive in battalions, each one knocking upon the door opened by the last. An instance of this melancholy truth may, I believe, be clearly seen in those unfortunate gentlemen who have the misfortune to have any of their rogueries detected. For here discovery once begun seldom stops its relentless march till the whole tangled web is come out into the light of day. Thus it happened with a crushing inevitability to poor Tom. No sooner had the storm surrounding the sold horse subsided, and Tom been pardoned for that singular act of secret charity, than a new tempest broke. It was discovered that he had some time before sold a fine leather-bound Bible, which Mr. Allworthy had personally given him as a gift to encourage his piety. The money arising from this sacred sale, it was revealed, he had disposed of in precisely the same manner, funneled directly into the desperate hands of Black George's family. How was this discovered, you ask? This very Bible had been purchased by none other than Master Blifil, though he already possessed an identical copy of his own. He claimed this act was motivated partly out of a profound respect for the Holy Book itself, and partly out of a seeming friendship to Tom, being unwilling, as he said with a pious sigh, that a Bible from the Allworthy library should be sold out of the family at a common fare for a mere half price. He therefore deposited the said half price himself, reclaiming the holy text from the hands of a stranger, for he was a very prudent lad indeed, and so careful of his money that he had laid up almost every penny he had ever received from his generous uncle, his coffers growing while his spirit shrunk. Now some people have been noted to be able to read in no book, but their own finding foreign annotations a distraction. On the contrary, from the very time when Master Blifil was first possessed of this second-hand Bible, he never used any other. Nay, he was seen reading in it with a show of deep devotion much oftener than he had before been seen in his own pristine copy. Now, as he frequently asked Thwackum, with an air of earnest inquiry, to explain difficult passages to him, that gentleman unfortunately took notice of Tom Jones's name, which was written in many parts of the book in a bold, youthful hand. This simple observation brought on a swift and stern inquiry, which, under the pressure of Thwackum's piercing gaze, obliged Master Blifil with a show of great reluctance to discover the whole matter. Thwackum was immediately resolved that a crime of this kind, which he loudly called not petty theft, but outright sacrilege, should not go unpunished. He therefore proceeded immediately to castigation, the remedy for all moral ailments in his philosophy, and not contented with that physical expression of justice, he acquainted Mr. Allworthy at their next meeting with what he deemed this monstrous crime inveighing against Tom in the most bitter terms, and likening him to the greedy buyers and sellers who were once driven out of the sacred temple by a wrathful Christ. Fascinated by these moral dilemmas, subscribe for more deep dives into the complexities of virtue and vice. Squire, of course, saw this matter in a very different light. He said with a philosopher's calm that he could not perceive any higher crime in selling one book than in selling another, that to sell Bibles in and of itself was strictly lawful by all laws, both divine and human, and consequently there was no inherent unfitness in the act. He then, with a subtle jab designed to irritate, told Thwackum that his great concern on this occasion brought to his mind the story of a very devout woman who, out of pure regard for religion, had once stolen Archbishop Tillotson's sermons from a lady of her acquaintance, believing the text too holy to remain in profane hands. This story, implying a comparison between Thwackum's zeal and a thief's, caused a vast quantity of blood to rush into the parson's face, which of itself was none of the palest. He was going to reply with great warmth and anger, his fist likely clenching, had not Mrs. Blifil, who was present at this debate, gracefully interposed. That lady, to the surprise of all, declared herself absolutely of Mr. Squire's side. She argued, indeed, very learnedly in support of his opinion, weaving a clever rhetorical tapestry, and concluded with saying that if Tom had been guilty of any fault in the selling, she must confess her own son appeared to be equally culpable in the buying, for that she could see no moral difference between the buyer and the seller, both of whom, she reminded them, were alike to be driven out of the temple in the scripture. Mrs. Blifil, having thus declared her opinion, put an immediate and decisive end to the debate. Squire's triumph was so complete, it almost stopped his words had he needed them, and Thwackum, who for reasons before mentioned durst not venture at disobliging the lady, was left almost choked with indignation, forced to swallow his fury. As for Mr. Allworthy, he said, with a weary air, that since the boy had been already punished by Thwackum's hand, he would not deliver his own sentiments on the occasion, and whether he was or was not privately angry with the lad, I must leave to the reader's own shrewd conjecture. Soon after this theological skirmish, a more worldly threat emerged. An action was brought against the gamekeeper Black George by the formidable Squire Weston, the very gentleman in whose manor the fateful partridge was killed for depredations of the like kind. This was a most unfortunate circumstance for the fellow, as it not only of itself threatened his utter ruin, but actually prevented Mr. Allworthy from restoring him to his favour. For how could he countermand the law of the land? Yet Tom had not given up. For as that gentleman was walking out one evening with Master Blifil and young Jones, the latter slyly and with purposeful misdirection drew him to the miserable habitation of Black George. There the entire family of that poor wretch, namely his weary wife and pallid children, were found in all the degrading misery with which cold hunger and nakedness can afflict human creatures. The scene was a perfect portrait of despair, for as to the money they had received from Jones's various sales, former more pressing debts had consumed almost the whole, leaving them in a state as destitute as before. Such a scene as this, painted with the stark colours of genuine human suffering, could not fail of affecting the heart of Mr. Allworthy. He immediately gave the mother a couple of golden guineas, with which he bid her clothe her shivering children. The poor woman burst into tears at this unexpected goodness, and while she was thanking him, could not refrain from expressing her overwhelming gratitude to Tom, who had, she said, long preserved both her and hers from outright starving. "We have not," says she, her voice trembling with emotion, "had a morsel to eat, nor have these poor children had a rag to put on. But what his goodness hath bestowed on us, for indeed the reader must now know, besides the horse and the Bible, Tom had secretly sacrificed a valuable nightgown and several other of his own possessions to the use of this distressed family. Who do you think acts more virtuously, Tom, with his secret charity, or Blifil with his public piety?" debated in the comments. On their return home, Tom, his heart full of hope, made use of all his natural eloquence to display the wretchedness of these people and the sincere penitence of Black George himself. In this he succeeded so well that Mr. Allworthy, visibly moved, said he thought the man had suffered enough for what was past, that he would forgive him and think of some means of providing for him and his family. Jones was so delighted with this news that though it was dark and a chill had settled when they returned home, he could not help going back a mile in a sudden shower of rain to acquaint the poor woman with the glad tidings. His heart raced with the joy of being the bearer of good fortune, but like other hasty divulgers of news, he only brought on himself the trouble of contradicting it. For the ill fortune of Black George, a persistent shadow made use of the very opportunity of his friend's absence to overturn all again, proving once more that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the path to redemption is often washed away by a sudden downpour. If young Tom Jones was abundantly furnished with that amiable, if sometimes misguided, quality of mercy, Master Blifil fell most conspicuously short of his companion in this, yet he as greatly exceeded him in one of a much colder and more calculating kind, namely in the rigid application of justice. In this stern pursuit he followed both the precepts and the daily example of his tutors, Thwackum and Squire. For though both gentlemen would make frequent and sonorous use of the word mercy in their discourses, it was plain to any discerning observer that in reality Square held it to be fundamentally inconsistent with the immutable rule of right, and Thwackum was perpetually for doing the harsh work of justice himself on earth, and leaving the uncertain business of mercy to the distant halls of heaven. The two gentlemen did indeed somewhat differ in opinion concerning the proper objects of this sublime virtue, a divergence which, if their philosophies were ever fully implemented, would probably have led Thwackum to destroy one half of mankind through righteous severity, and Square the other half through philosophical consistency. Master Blifil then, though he had kept a cunning silence in the immediate presence of Jones, yet, when he had retired to the quiet of his chamber, and better considered the matter, could by no means endure the thought of suffering his uncle to confer valuable favours on one so thoroughly undeserving in his eyes. The very idea was an offence to his sense of order. He therefore resolved immediately to acquaint Mr. Allworthy with a damning fact which we have above only slightly hinted to the readers, the truth of which was as follows. The gamekeeper, Black George, about a year after he was dismissed from Mr. Allworthy's service, and before Tom's desperate sale of the horse, in a period of such extreme want that he knew not how to fill his own mouth or those of his weeping family, was passing through a field belonging to the formidable Squire Western. There his desperate eyes espied a hare sitting motionless in her form. This hare, driven by the pangs of hunger that drown out the voice of law, he had basely and barbarously knocked on the head. This act was committed not only against the strict laws of the land, but no less against the sacred unwritten laws of sportsmen. The higgler, a petty dealer to whom the unfortunate hare was sold, being himself unfortunately taken many months later, with a quantity of illegal game upon his person, was obliged to make his peace with the squire by turning king's evidence against another poacher, and now Black George was pitched upon by him as being a person already obnoxious to Mr. Weston, and one whose reputation in the country was already tarnished. He was besides the most convenient sacrifice the higgler could make, as George had supplied him with no game since that one fateful hare, and by this means the witness had a ready opportunity of screening his better, more regular customers, the squire being charmed with the power of punishing a man whom a single transgression was sufficient to utterly ruin, made no further inquiry. His thirst for justice quenched by this easy conviction. Had this fact been laid plainly and simply before Mr. Allworthy, it might probably have done the gamekeeper very little mischief, seen as a desperate act in a time of dire need. But there is no zeal so blinder than that which is inspired by the love of justice against those already deemed offenders. Master Blifil, in his eagerness, had forgotten the significant distance of time since the event. He varied likewise in the manner of the fact, amplifying the crime through semantics, and by the hasty venomous addition of the single letter S, he considerably altered the story. For he did not say George had killed a Times hare, but that George had wired hares, implying a habitual commercial poaching operation. These alterations might probably have been set right in a fair hearing, had not Master Blifil unluckily insisted on a promise of secrecy from Mr. Allworthy before he revealed the matter to him. But by that means the poor gamekeeper was condemned unheard, without having an opportunity to defend himself, for as the fact of killing the one hare and of the subsequent legal action were certainly true, Mr. Allworthy, bound by his promise, and presented with a distorted truth, had no doubt concerning the rest of the fabricated tale. Love analyzing complex characters like the cunning Blifil. Subscribe for more literary character studies. Short-lived then was the joy of these poor people, for Mr. Allworthy the next morning declared with a clouded brow that he had fresh reason, without assigning it, for his renewed anger. He strictly forbade Tom from ever mentioning the name of George any more, though as for the fellow's family, he said with a sigh, he would endeavour to keep them from starving. But as to the incorrigible fellow himself, he would leave him to the harshness of the laws, which he was convinced nothing could keep such a man from breaking. Tom, with his open and unsuspecting nature, could by no means divine what had so suddenly incensed Mr. Allworthy, for of Master Blifil's whispered treachery he had not the least suspicion. However, as his friendship was of a kind to be tired out by no disappointments, he now determined to try another more daring method of preserving the poor gamekeeper from total ruin. By a happy turn of fortune, Jones was lately grown very intimate with the boisterous Squire Weston. He had so greatly recommended himself to that gentleman, not by flattery, but by action, by fearlessly leaping over 5-barred gates, by displaying an intuitive knowledge of the hunt, and by other acts of raw natural sportsmanship, that the Squire had declared on multiple occasions that Tom would certainly make a great man if he had but sufficient encouragement. He often wished with a loud oath that he himself had a son with such parts, and one day very solemnly asserted at a jovial drinking bout that Tom should hunt a pack of hounds for £1,000 of his money against any huntsman in the whole country. By such kind of irresistible manly talents he had so ingratiated himself with the Squire that he was a most welcome guest at his table, and a favourite companion in his sport. Everything which the Squire held most dear, to wit his beloved guns, his baying dogs, and his spirited horses, were now as much at the command of Jones as if they had been his own. He resolved therefore to make use of this hard-won favour on behalf of his friend Black George, whom he hoped to introduce into Mr. Weston's family in the same capacity in which he had before served Mr. Allworthy. The prudent reader, if he considers that this fellow was already obnoxious to Mr. Gratian Weston, and if he considers farther the weighty business of poaching by which that gentleman's most sacred displeasure had been incurred, will perhaps condemn this as a foolish and desperate undertaking, a forlorn hope. But if he should totally condemn young Jones on that account, he will greatly applaud him for the cleverness with which he strengthened himself with all imaginable interest on so arduous an occasion. Who would you rather have as a friend, the loyal but impulsive Tom, or the prudent but cunning Blifil? Debate below. For this purpose, then, Tom applied not directly to the Squire, whose temper was as unpredictable as the weather, but to Mr. Weston's daughter, the charming Sophia. She was a young lady of about 17 years of age, whom her father next, after those necessary implements of sport, just before mentioned, loved and esteemed above all the world. Now, as she had some gentle influence on the Squire's rough heart, so Tom had, without even striving for it, some little influence on her. But this fair creature, being the intended heroine of this work, a lady with whom we ourselves are greatly in love, and with whom many of our readers will probably be in love too before we have the pleasure of parting, it is by no means proper she should make her first momentous appearance at the end of a book. Such a jewel must be unveiled at the beginning of a new volume with the fanfare she so richly deserves. And so, dear reader, we draw the curtain upon this first act of our grand drama. We have traversed together from that fateful night when an infant was discovered upon the pillow of the benevolent Squire Allworthy, to the tumultuous adolescence of young Tom Jones, a boy as full of heart as he is lacking in prudence. We have witnessed the sowing of seeds that will yield both bitter and sweet harvests in seasons to come. The steadfast, if sometimes blind compassion of Mr. Allworthy stands in stark contrast to the calculated virtue of Master Blifil. The rigid dogmatism of Thwackum clashes endlessly with the theoretical philosophies of Squire, while both in their hypocrisy vie for the affections of the widow Blifil. And we have just glimpsed, waiting in the wings, the figure of Sophia Weston, who is destined to become the true north of our hero's moral compass. The stage is now set. The characters are in motion, propelled by their natures. Tom by his impulsive generosity, Blifil by his envious cunning, and Allworthy by his earnest desire to see good in a world that often presents him with ambiguity. This journey through Tom Jones's youth is just the beginning. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next in this epic tale of virtue, vice, and everything in between. Remember, the story of Tom Jones holds up a mirror to our own souls. It asks us to consider, what is true honor? Where does righteousness end and self-righteousness begin? Can good intentions ever justify wrong actions? As we leave Tom at this crossroads, his heart large, his prospect greatest trials yet ahead, we carry these questions with us. The universe of this narrative, much like our own, obeys its own laws of cause and consequence. The friendships forged, the secrets kept, the lies told, and the sacrifices made, all will resonate through the lives of these characters, creating a tapestry of fate as complex and intertwined as any in life itself. What do you predict will happen to Tom Jones? Will his good heart save him, or will his lack of caution be his downfall? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Thank you, valued reader, for embarking on this journey through the opening chapters of Henry Fielding's masterpiece. Your discernment and engagement have brought these pages to life. Until we meet again to unravel the next thread of this intricate human web, may your own virtues be guided by wisdom and your vices tempered by compassion.